You're watching the Oxford Political Review in conversation with the former Prime Minister, Finance and Foreign Minister of Finland, Professor Alexander Stubb. I'm Brian Wong, the founder of the Review. It's an absolute honor and pleasure to have you here with us, Professor.
Nice to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So I just want to start with the elephant in the room, which is the war in Ukraine right now. Now, recently in Davos, you made a comment that perhaps in our commentary and analysis of the war, we are too Eurocentric in pitting quite literally the Europe and the West against Russia and setting Ukraine war as a sort of dichotomy between the two, when in practice there's so much more at stake. And yet, from looking at sort of what's been going on so far in the war, I guess some might argue that the predominant mantle of opposing Putin's invasion has fallen on European countries and members of the proverbial West, and I suppose Japan, Canada, and Australia by extension as well. And yet it does strike me and strike many, I guess, that it's only a select segment of the world's population that has come out to stand against the war. So how can we end such Eurocentrism when in practice it strikes me that the opposition is rooted in a rather Eurocentric sense of conception of international relations and geopolitical interests? Is there any way of mobilizing and galvanizing other countries' interests beyond European sphere? What do you think of that?
Well, I think the conflict basically can be framed into two contexts. One is Russia and the West. That's basically what we're doing. But the other one is also the West and the rest. So you could say that Russia and the West is the micro context and West and the rest is the macro context. So on the micro side, I think the scene is pretty clear. You know, it's so close for comfort. I'm sitting right now here in Finland with 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. It's a shorter flight to Kiev than it is to Brussels from here. So we understand that basically the situation is such that we have created a new Iron Curtain between Russia and roughly 40 European democratic states that want to cooperate, and that Russia will be isolated. And on the other side of the fence, you have the sort of liberal Democrats, if you will. But the other framing is also to understand that, you know, the reaction of the rest of the world wasn't as, how would I say, strong or emotional or attached as the one we saw in the West. And the reason for this is very simple. So, you know, the vote in the UN, 141 in favor or condemning Russia, 35 abstaining and 4 in favor of Russia. The vote on 141 was actually quite soft. Then the 35, that's over half of the world's population that abstained, included China and India. And then the 4 rogue states, we don't really worry about that much. But the bottom line is that the rest is sending a message to the West, whether they're an African state or an Asian state or Latin American, that listen, this is your war. It has ramifications on our inflation, on our food price, on our energy, on our fertilizer prices. But you better sort this out. And on top of that, don't come over here and start moralizing us about war and which side we should be on, when you basically have been the source of war. So that's why I'm saying that, you know, sometimes we're just a little bit too Eurocentric, which is understandable.
That's very fair. And I guess even then, you know, within Europe, I want to sort of pick up on a phrase you used just then, the 40 odd or so democratic countries within Europe, as you outlined and identified just then. Because I guess my worry there to some extent is that maybe Europe is also less united and more divided internally than it seems to be, for 2 potential reasons. The first being that authoritarian encroachment and democratic backsliding has been seen in countries ranging from Hungary to some extent Poland, and also, you know, in a form of populist far-right extremists or extremism, so to speak, even in France and closer to home, so to speak, in Western Europe. And secondly, the costs of the defensive and reparatory measures adopted against Russia, whether it be in sanctions or, you know, cutting off access to gas and whatnot, the costs of that have been predominantly borne, I guess, by select countries within Europe, where we see Germany, for instance, as a massively dependent country upon Russian natural gas, and Eurozone inflation has hit over 8.1%, I think, in recent weeks. So it strikes me that the seeds for disunity and seeds for disagreement amongst democracies and also between semi-democracies and democracies within Europe may well be larger and more potent than we'd like them to be. Do you agree with that diagnosis, or do you think maybe this is too gloomy an assessment?
Well, I think it's a question of timing. I mean, first observation is to say that, you know, in my 30 years as an EU nerd, both as a civil servant, academic, and a politician, I've never seen the European Union more united, more adamant, more determined, more effective. I mean, the rollout of the first 3 waves of sanctions took 4 days. 5th sanction wave came in, the 6th sanction wave came in, reversal of financing arms, full solidarity, no major problems with 5.5 million refugees. So, no matter how much you think the glass is half empty, half full, I mean, we've just never seen anything like this before. And thanks to Putin, I guess, for that. Now, the timing issue then comes that at some stage war fatigue hits in. It's quite natural. And, I was at Davos and I met a Ukrainian delegation there a couple of weeks back. And I warned them and said that you have to be careful, how you communicate the war, because now a lot of political leaders in Europe, following their general public, are starting to look more at growth, inflation, therefore stagflation, energy prices, food prices, and the refugee crisis. And that means that sort of there will be a shift, a tilt in the balance of the conversation. And when that happens, you start looking at yourself in the mirror, what are my next elections? What should I be looking at? And then perhaps, solidarity and unity starts waning. But for me, that's normal. Remember that the European Union is all about compromises. Usually you get 3 phases. 1 is crisis, 2 is chaos, and 3 is suboptimal solution. I mean, it's not this utopia where everyone is sort of, love, peace, and flowers and kissing each other and thinking about unified position. It's all about finding compromises between various interests. So there's nothing more, radical about that.
And on that note about compromise, because what I'm getting here and what I'm hearing right now is that there's an increasing division in terms of approaches to take towards the war. So one view holds that, we cannot ever yield or compromise or surrender. And any and all folks who seek to talk about a compromise solution or whatever Macron's doing right now, for instance, is seen as essentially an offense to democracy or an assault to the values that people stand by in Europe. Whereas the other school saying, we do need to offer an off-ramp, some sort of brokered peace. Yes, it doesn't sound nice. It's not pleasing, but it's nevertheless a moral necessity in a grand scheme of things of ensuring that you get a modus vivendi that at least upholds the interests of Ukrainians and also innocent Russians, and that bring to an end the conflict as soon as is possible. Do you see this as a false dichotomy, or do you see this as a valid sort of characterization of the increasing fray in the debate in Europe right now?
Well, I think it's a valid assessment. At the same time, I think it's a little bit binary, but I guess we live sometimes in a fairly binary world. And when you have a grand aggressor like Russia attacking the territorial integrity and sovereignty of an independent state like Ukraine, you have to take sides. The side for me is quite clear. We are on the side of Ukraine. Then you come to the question that, when do you start trying to mediate peace? And I did that in the war in Georgia in 2008 when I was foreign minister and chairman of the OSCE. The stakes were much lower and we're able to broker a ceasefire in 5 days. But the end result were 2 frozen conflicts, basically the loss of territory for Georgia and South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Was that a good deal? Well, in terms of saving lives, yeah. But in terms of, sticking to international law and rules, the answer is no. Same thing with the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. So if you were to ask me and force me to give you an answer about, how much am I appeasement and how much am I sort of war, I guess I'm 75% war, 25% appeasement. So you need to have some kind of dialogue. But, any talk about, saving face for Putin, I mean, it's a little bit like did people want to save face for Hitler? It's so, you have to have the diplomatic channels going. But at the same time, I think it's up to the Ukrainians to make that call, not for me, you, or anyone else for that matter.
I think that's a very fair assessment. And also I would add to that actually a note that you need to some extent some degree of ongoing conflict and also urgency in order to bring parties to the negotiating table. Otherwise, you can't exactly sit around a bonfire and kumbaya and hope that would bring about a ceasefire. That's just not how negotiations with, an autocratic leader that's very much personally invested in the war, I guess, works in that sense. Now I want to shift the attention onto the elephant in the room, which is China, because I think the commentary that I've been hearing so far, on China's role in Sino-Russian relations has also unfortunately slipped into the binary, where you either have folks saying, China was completely caught off guard They have nothing whatsoever to do with the war. They are completely innocent. They're just there as also a passive victim of the events unfolding, or alternatively have some more conspiring or conspiracy-centered characterizations of China as basically a passive abettor, if not a supporter of Putin's efforts. The way I would like to put it is I think there's a more nuanced position to be struck there, which is that China was most probably not an active endorser of the war, nor did it necessarily want to see, given all the fallout that ensued, indeed, the war drag on in a perpetuity into the current state that it's in quasi-frozenness. And yet more practically looking forward, right, going forward, I know you repeatedly made the suggestion that getting China on side is advisable. Maybe it's not the only way, but certainly a useful way of brokering and mediating peace, so to speak. The trouble, I guess, here is that Beijing, or at least some vocal voices in Beijing, seem to view the conflict through lenses, rather binary lenses, mind you, of West versus the rest, or of China's rise being potentially stifled by forces that are hostile towards China. And in this case, it's more likely that the hostile party is NATO as opposed to Russia. So in face of such, I guess, binary intransigence and you might say fears and skepticism from certain quarters within Beijing, what do you think the EU, or more broadly speaking, the US and the EU, what exactly do you think can be done to assuage these worries and to bring China on side? Or is it not a goal that's worth having or achieving in the first place?
Well, I guess the starting point is to say that I think you have one of the leading China experts at Oxford with Rana Mitter. I mean, I usually follow his advice on these kinds of things and had many conversations with him early on in the war, actually. And I guess, the first observation to make is that I do think that Xi Jinping and China were a little bit caught off guard in the sense that Xi Jinping probably wanted to focus on two things rather than the war, and both of them are domestic. So first one is zero COVID policy, which I actually think is going to fail and has already failed because you can't contain a virus. And the second one was the upcoming party congress in October, November, depending on when they decide to organize it. And in that sense, this war was a bit of thorn in the side. At the same time, there is a bit of propaganda here as well. And we've seen a lot of the Chinese state media basically running the Russian story rather than the Western story. And the reason for that is very simple. I think it would be rather uncomfortable for Xi Jinping if Putin were to fall, because that would be, an authoritarian leader going down the drains. But I said from the beginning that for all of those who said that, this is the beginning of a new Cold War where you have a liberal world order versus an authoritarian world order, and that there will be clear decoupling between China and the West, and Russia is going to be a player in this. I said, no, that's not the case. I mean, my analysis is that China needs the West more than it needs Russia. On top of that, China is very, risk averse in the sense that they care about their own reputation. And they're scared about secondary sanctions. I mean, the example that I give is a business with China and Russia is roughly 80 billion euros. China and Europe is over 800 billion euros. So, banks, the general economy, the tech industry is much more interested in the West than it is in the Russia. This doesn't mean that, China's not going to play the game. They're going to make Russia into a vassal state. 30 years ago, their economies were equal in size. Now China is 10 times bigger. So China will go in and fill the power vacuums that will be left by the West. But China is not going to pivot to Russia. But I do think that we need to keep China engaged. It's easier to do. China is more patient. China is more inward looking than Russia. And in that sense, I'm more hopeful about that relationship.
And on that front, I would also add, I guess, China or the Chinese bureaucracy does think in multiple modes or multiple tracks. If we are to draw upon Kahneman's language of sort of type 1 or mode 1, mode 2 thinking, where you have on one track the more political and ideologically driven conception of international relations, of the world order, the so-called idea of China's rise being an inevitable sort of conclusion, East rises, West falls. So that's one way through which they look at the world, which strikes most folks as more binary and more Manichaean, really. Yet the other mode, which is, I guess, this subtler mode that affects actually more of the upper middle class, the elite, and by extension, so the state organs that care about economic interests, it's the globalization and financial integration path, where they do want to seek a balancing and a preservation of not just important financial and economic interests, but also China's ability to connect with the world at large in personnel and trade and whatnot. And these two modes often come into context and conflict in uniquely the context of Chinese governance and politics. So I guess if I may add sort of an appendage to what you said just then, Professor, maybe the thought here is how can we nudge China to shift from one to another, or maybe such nudging is difficult to do, so to speak, given sort of the innately opaque and also inward-looking nature of politics, as you outlined just then in your thoughts. So that's just a brief comment on China. But on the note of the invasion per se, do you see this as driven predominantly by structural factors and elements within the Russian state, or does this have more to do uniquely with Putin's sort of personal decisions and his personal calculus, which in many ways does, I guess, embody the Russian state, but it doesn't necessarily encapsulate the entirety of bureaucracy? Do you think that's a fair sort of assessment or setup? And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that front. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to oversimplify, but if you do just a little bit of a scratch of Russian military security or geopolitical history, you'll very soon notice that essentially it's been an imperial revisionist power, one that hates disorder. So the Romanovs came in the 1600s as a Tsarist family after a period of disorder, and therefore Russian leadership was always very centralized, never questioned, and often God-given, apart from the class struggle which then took place after the Bolshevik Revolution. But it's been very much a top-down system, and it's always been a clientelist system as well, kleptocratic and quite corrupt, in the sense that the Tsar or the president or the supreme leader of the Communist Party was able to give power to governors to govern, though they did not own their governorship. And at the same time, if you look at the countries, which is probably one of the most vast natural resources in the world, it gave this country, the sort of business side of things, you gave them economic advantage. So that's why you have all of these oligarchs. So is it structural? I do think it is. There's also this sort of history of Russians being fed from a very young age in the culture about that they're always surrounded, they're isolated, they're attacked. The rest of the world is out to get them. I mean, the words that have to do, they attack from the east, west, south, north. The words that have to do with torture and misery and death, they're most of Mongol roots because of the Mongol attacks in the olden days. It also believes that it has saved Europe twice. Once was from Napoleon Bonaparte and the other one was from Hitler. So now it's saving us from, Western liberal democratic decadence. So it's not one of these things that it's only Putin. There is a machinery behind that believes in it and gets sort of perks from it as well. And in that sense, I think it's a little bit of a Western misunderstanding to think that, the population is against the war and what Putin is doing. I have a tendency to believe in most of the opinion polls that come about rallying around the flag. So, I'm not saying it's a popular war, but it's not unpopular either.
And I guess the complex question there is it's about a matter of degrees, right? So you might have, broadly speaking, assonance or support for Russian militarism amongst the civilians, but it's not clear how far they'd go in both sort of the extent of gratuitous violence and violation. So if you show the abhorrent or images of the abhorrence and the atrocities being committed right now to an ordinary Russian civilian, they might say, even though we agree with this ideal at large, we don't really like what's going on here. So that's a disagreement in terms of the extent of wrongness, but there's also disagreement over the extent of costs. And I guess what a lot of accounts sort of concerning so-called purported regime change and transformations to the government in Russia seem to be counting upon is that at some point there'll be a breaking point where it's too much for the Russian population to bear. Now, I'm personally quite skeptical of that thought, namely because I think Russia has more wherewithal than most accounts tend to grant it, or at least a wherewithal and enough of that to keep the people sufficiently unwilling to or reluctant to rebel against the state. And even if there were indeed a ruler or leadership change, as you point out, Professor, all the factors we outlined just then, the culturalist explanations, the imaginary, suggest that there's more to this problem. You're not going to solve the problem by taking out Putin and swapping in another Russian nationalist has strong views about Ukraine. So if that's indeed the case, then what do you see as the likely trajectory and prognosis for the conflict? Is it another conflict? Is it denouement or escalation due to the irrational decisions or partly irrational decisions of select leaders in the crisis?
Well, I don't think anyone really knows that, but if history is anything to go by, usually we say that, in a democracy, the leader doesn't leave in a coffin to jail or in exile. But in Russia, which is not a democracy, actually the leaders are quite often saved. I mean, there are not too many cases of assassinations. So, for instance, Khrushchev was allowed to continue. Gorbachev was allowed to continue life afterwards. Yeltsin was given a safe haven as well. And the same would probably go with Putin. Sometimes also, after regime change, you get more extremist forces and hardliners coming in, like with the Yanayev junta in August 1991. So it's not a foregone conclusion that you get a peace-loving Democrat to run Russia. I mean, it's not in the DNA of Russian governance, if there is some such thing as a Russian governance DNA. Now, the end game, I really don't know. I'm quite reluctant even to second guess. I mean, to a certain extent, it was a frozen conflict, which was, warm all the time and then got really hot. And I think the playbook of Putin has always been quite similar, but now he's just faced with a different situation in the sense that he's in a full-scale conventional war, which he thought he would, win in 48 hours and install a Russian puppet regime in Kiev, and he failed with that. So it's been a military disaster, but what the end game is, I just don't have the answer for that, I'm afraid.
No, and I think that sort of honesty and candor in your response is certainly something I think most commentators would benefit from having a bit more, because one commentator that has become quite renowned as a result of this crisis, even though he's also quite renowned previously, was a certain gentleman that we interviewed 2.5 years back, John Mearsheimer, who raised an argument concerning sort of Russian interests and how his theory is that Russia's aggression was a result of the perceived encroachment upon Russian territory, so to speak, by NATO and whatnot. Now, I certainly don't agree with his diagnosis. And I actually think one of the elements we touched on just then, which is the innate desire, or the revanchist desire on the part of the Russian people or the Russian nation to reclaim so-called Russian territories, such as Ukraine, for its own. That's probably the missing part of his account that he doesn't take seriously. That regardless of what NATO or small and medium states would have done in Eastern Europe, there would have been a desire to expand on a part of Russia. But I guess the obligatory question to follow, though, is why now? Why 2022, as opposed to, say, the aftermath of the Maidan in 2014 events concerning Crimean annexation? Why this year and not later or previously?
Well, first thing is to say about Mearsheimer and a lot of the realist school. I mean, obviously, if you accept that international law is worthless, that the Helsinki Accords from 1975 are irrelevant, and that it is a just act for a grand aggressor to basically annex territory from smaller players, and that you live in this sort of eternal jungle of big powers, then I guess one has to understand the realist argument. But, I still think it's a choice. And it's interesting to see, actually, that you have kind of extreme right and extreme left, and you have if I may, the peace movement joining hands with the realist school, and both of them sort of perhaps failing to see the paradox in this whole sort of line of argumentation. And in any case, if you're part of the realist school and you say, well, appeasement is the way to go about it, I just don't see it or understand it. So I'm a little bit confused with that line of argumentation, and would like to look at it from a different perspective. But your second question was, if you could repeat it.
It was essentially why 2022. Why not?
Yeah. So there are a lot of theories about this. I mean, first of all, with Putin, anytime you show weakness, he's going to take a step forward. So it's the old Stalinist saying that if you have a bayonet and it's soft, push it in. But if it's hard, pull it out. So for Putin, the bayonet It was soft in the war in Georgia in 2008. It was soft certainly in Crimea in 2014. And he thought he could do the same thing in 2022. That's why the playbook and the game plan was very similar. Now, my understanding is that probably one of the reasons, well, there are many reasons, but one of them is his legacy. He wanted to be seen as, the unifier of great Russia with one language, one religion, and one leader himself. So bring back Russian borders roughly around the 1800s, which would then mean Belarus and Ukraine. So it was about his legacy. But secondly, also, it's my understanding that he was starting to get a bit cold feet about the sort of armament of Ukraine, because they actually had a lot more weaponry than he had expected, and was afraid that something could happen and he'd be pushed back then from the Donbas region. And he felt that this was probably the last moment to attack. But I should also remind everyone and all of us, all those who are listening here, this wasn't essentially about NATO expansion. This was about identity. He wanted to see a Russian Ukraine. That's what it was at the end of the day. So this was about values more than about security and power. And that's why it was for him the last moment to make the attack. But of course, he mixed strategy and tactics and got it horribly wrong, because everything that he tried to do went completely topsy-turvy, including the Europeanization of Ukraine, the unification of Europe, revitalization of the transatlantic partnership, rejuvenation of NATO, and the icing on the cake is, of course, Finland's and Sweden's NATO membership. So there you go. Big failure from the Kremlin part.
I think you made a very potent critique of sort of Mearsheimer's approach, or I guess other realists who share his theoretical or methodological approach to the matter at hand. But given that sort of your academic background and training, I do want to press this point a tad further. I want to make a sort of defensive realism, not necessarily, to be very clear, Mearsheimer's argument, but that I would posit that a more expansive understanding of realism that takes not just security interests, but also economic interests and the importance of multilateral agreements as both a symbol and a basis of future long-term gains, right, or sequential gains. And finally, that takes seriously culture and ideas, not as constructed entities that are either exogenous or accepted as secondary, but instead primary sometimes to a country's conception of power. If we incorporate all of these elements into realism, which I think they can do and has been done over recent years, then the diagnosis that they offer isn't so much, that it should be the case that might makes right, but that it simply is the case in the status quo that might makes right, and that there's a need or an imperative on our part to try and tackle that and to resolve that. Do you think that salvages, the realist school?
Well, I'll be very frank with you. I've been Prime Minister, Foreign Minister, and Finance Minister, and I have a PhD in international relations. And the language that you talk is extremely theoretical. And that's one of the big problems that I think we have in academia, that people start talking about concepts and things which, form sort of an academic intellectual bubble, and they're very far away grounded from reality and how real decisions are made. In many ways, politics and international relations is about wrong and right and defending your own prerogative, defending your argument, and defending your interests. And people don't think in terms of, games or theories and so on and so forth. So the situation on the ground is that, Russia attacked Ukraine, and now it's a question of how can we liberate Ukraine and how we best do that. So the last thing in a lot of practitioners' minds right now is, is the realist school right or wrong? It's kind of irrelevant. It's a nice intellectual exercise, but, it's a bubble that I think sometimes needs to be bursted. That's why I like the likes of, E.H. Carr or Henry Kissinger, not necessarily agreeing with the stuff, but at least they're grounded in reality rather than just academic discourse. And I don't mean that as an insult, it's quite contrary, just a warning that and right now I see that. This sort of the realist school of thinking is almost becoming a cult, and it's fine, but it's irrelevant,
I think that's so important. And actually, I wanted to ask you a personal question as we come to nearly the end of our interview, which is, how has your being in and practicing politics shaped the way you research about write about and think about politics? Do you think, political experience, or at least experience of being involved in politics, is a necessary prerequisite for a successful career ideally in terms of becoming a public intellectual over politics, even if not in academia? Because obviously there's this...
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think it's a prerequisite or necessity as such, but it has helped me a lot, because I can just see what kind of an intellectual academic I would have become without being grounded in the sort of practical world. And to a certain extent, I think I had a lot of strength from the fact that I had an academic background when I was in politics. I mean, you're never perfect, right? So, in the academic world, I feel sometimes a little bit like an outsider because I'm not, theoretical enough, and I probably haven't published enough journals, though I've published quite a few books. And then in politics, I sometimes felt that, this is just too rough. I mean, why don't you just sit down and read a book and think about the concepts, and then we'll find a solution from there. So it's one of these 6 of one, half a dozen of the others. But I certainly feel very fortunate in that I can make a fairly good claim on the sort of, discourse side, because I have a theoretical grounding and a practical experience. It doesn't make you into a better or worse person. It just makes you into a slightly different person, I guess.
That's super fair. And last question for today, actually, is Finland and also Sweden are on the way to joining NATO as of obviously, prospective member countries and states of that pact. Where do you see the future for Finland in terms of its greatest challenges in both foreign policy and I guess domestic politics as well? And how confident and hopeful are you that as a country it can overcome these challenges?
Well, I'm quite confident, and Finns have a tendency to react when history throws something at it. So in 1809, when Sweden lost us to Russia, we maximized our autonomy. In 1917, we declared independence in the middle of the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1944, we reluctantly accepted peace and the loss of 10% of our territory. In 1992, only 6 months after the Soviet Union collapsed, we filed for membership in the European Union because we could. And now when, Russia attacked Ukraine, or Putin attacked Ukraine, the Finnish public decided that, hey, you political leaders, time to join NATO. So I feel quite comfortable. We've balanced our idealism and realism quite well. Idealism in the sense that we want to bona fide cooperate with the Russians, but realism in the sense that we have one of the biggest standing armies in Europe. So, I'm very happy personally, because I've been an advocate of Finnish NATO membership for over 30 years. So I'm happy it's happening now. Of course, it's a tragic way of happening, but, when realities on the ground change, you change. So, I'm quite confident that, Finland will continue to go from strength to strength, but you have to stay vigilant when you're doing it.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Professor. It has been an absolute pleasure having you. And on behalf of the audience, thank you. And let's hope that indeed the conflict can be resolved as soon as is possible in a judicious and fair manner. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for the interview as well. Really nice to see you.
Thank you.